Kia ora mai tātou, tūtahi māku e mi ana kia koutou, ko tai mai e tēnei rā, ko Anton Coffin tēnei e mi atu kia koutou, e tukuna tu ngā mihi kia koutou. Tēnā tātou.
And you are?
Oh, sorry, I said my name is Anton Coffin, I'm an Independent Commissioner.
Great, thanks very much for that. Just for those of you who haven't been to a hearing before, the general process we run is that I'll first of all ask the officers, reporting officers, if there's any procedural matters or updates they need to bring to our attention. And then Mr. Randall, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and your team, and then the rest of the day is for the applicant to present their case to us. There's been a large amount of pre-circulated material, so the applicant's witnesses won't be reading out their evidence because we've already read it, but they're likely to summarise key points and address additional matters. Tomorrow and Wednesday we hear from submitters. Both Tuesday and Wednesday we commence at 9 a.m. This afternoon, weather permitting, we intend to do a site visit, and the timing of that will just be dependent on where we get to today. If it's raining this afternoon, then we'll delay that till Wednesday. So, reporting officers, anything you wish to bring to our attention at this stage?
Yes, good morning. My name is Jo Creswell, Consents Officer for Bay of Plenty Regional Council. So I have some procedural matters to cover. In regards to the number of submitters on the application, approximately 16 of 37 persons have changed their position in regards to requesting to be heard and either no longer wish to be heard or are unavailable to attend the hearing. This has been covered in an updated hearing schedule circulated to the parties from Ms. Carmeta, Committee Advisor, Bay of Plenty Regional Council. Mr. Gerard Casey, CEO of Eastern Bay of Plenty Chamber of Commerce, has advised Council that he ticked the wrong box, not wishing to be heard when filling out his submission form. He has subsequently advised that he does wish to be heard in support of his submission. My opinion is that I don't think anyone or any person is disadvantaged by allowing Mr. Casey to speak to his submission. I have previously raised this with the Chair, who has advised that Mr. Casey should have the opportunity to speak. Section 7.5.2, paragraph 5 of my section 42A report quotes Mr. Blackwood's, who is Principal Technical Engineer at Bay of Plenty Regional Council, comments in relation to stormwater detention being to a minimum standard of 80% of pre-development peak discharge. Since making that comment and reviewing the statement provided in paragraph 60 of Mr. Van Zyle's statement of evidence, Mr. Blackwood has clarified his position of advising that he is in agreement with the 100% requirement because it relates to the 72-hour 100-year storm event. I note that Mr. Blackwood has since agreed with the applicant's proposed condition 5, which addresses this matter. Corrections. In section 8.1 of my, apologies, that should say section 42A, not 24, report, as part of my response to objective 5 of the Regional Water and Land Plan, objective KT05 of the Natural Resources Plan, I note that I was unable to obtain a copy of the document Wahitapu Sites of Ngāti Awa 2000. I did subsequently obtain a copy from Council's records and discussed it later in my report in section 8.5.1 as a relevant iwi management plan. I neglected to update my statement in section 8.1 and would like to correct this point, that I have reviewed this document and commented on it. I can provide copies of this document through the hearings advisor if requested. The Becker Memorandum entitled Creswell New Zealand Limited Pond Volume in relation to amended stormwater design was dated 27th of November 2017 and was submitted to the Bay of Plenty Regional Council on 28th of November 2017. The date included in draft proposed conditions, pre-circulated, notes that the date is 29th of November 2017. Therefore, this requires amending if those conditions are adopted. As noted in my response to Commissioner Van Bulthausen's questions dated 26th of April 2018, the current allocated abstractions from the Awaiti Canal groundwater catchment equate to 207.79 litres per second, which is the average annual rate of take, including the current existing resource consent for the site 20595. An updated analysis of all the resource consents within this groundwater catchment was undertaken on 24th of April 2018, which included updating further allocation made available by the surrender of one resource consent, 20607, within this groundwater catchment, and that was on the 18th of April 2018. An appendix of current resource consents was included in the response to the Commissioner's questions mentioned above, however is also attached to this document as Appendix 1 for reference.
Great, thank you very much. Antoine, any questions on that?
No, I don't know.
No further questions from us on that. Anything else from the reporting team?
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Anne Nicholas. I am the Consultant Planner for Whakatane District Council. I just have a few corrections to my report that I'd like to identify. In addition to, there was a procedural matter identified in relation to one of the status of one of the submitters, which you're aware of already. The corrections in paragraph 6.3, the total capacity to be bottled will be 156,000 bottles per hour. The 146,000 bottles per hour is the increase from the current 8,000. Apologise. And the number of truck movements per day will be 184, not 190 in paragraph 6.6. Next one was just to clarify that the summary in 7.10 was to identify that the status of the activity would be the same whether it was considered under 127 or under the plan. Paragraph 8.4, the Bay of Plenty Regional Council has submitted in relation to works within 60 metres of a stop bank has advised that it does not wish to be heard on the basis of and subject to suggested conditions, together with the outcome of the geotechnical report and peer review. And the final point there is to set out the conditions that the Council's roading or transportation team have requested, which I will ensure included in an updated set of conditions later when I have the opportunity to speak on Wednesday. I thought I should include those so that the applicant has seen them if they haven't already.
Great, thank you very much for that. Antoine, any questions?
I didn't.
Well, over to you.
Sit down if that's okay. It's
Yeah,
very happy to stand if you prefer to see me in that aspect, but in your hands there, sir.
Oh, look, no, you don't have to stand on our account, thanks.
Thank you. May I just begin by introducing myself? So I'm Dave Randall. I'm here with my colleague Alana Garland-Dugnan, who's approaching the panel just to hand up our legal submissions and a bundle of authorities.
Okay.
And we are obviously the lawyers for the applicant, Creswell New Zealand Limited, here. As I say, there are some legal submissions, and Alana's just going to circulate those to everyone else here right now. While she's doing that, so may I begin just by saying how exciting this opportunity is. It's great to be here in this wonderful place. Obviously, I'm leading out, talking on behalf of a large team of Creswell's representatives and experts advising that company. And as will be clear, I think, from the vast reams of documents that we've foisted upon the panel, both in the application and since then, a great deal of work's gone into developing this project over a large number of years. And I'd like to acknowledge that work, but one can understand that getting to a day like this is a very exciting culmination in some sense of all that work. Not only the work, may I add, of Creswell and its advisors, but the work of others in this room as well, notably the council officers, obviously all of the people with whom people have shared willingly of their time and engaged with Creswell throughout the consultation processes, obviously the tangata whenua, the neighbours to the site. And yeah, so it's a very exciting day, and I'd like to acknowledge all those contributions that have brought us to this point. And thank you also to the panel for taking on this role and considering these applications. The legal submissions, sure the panel will be eagerly looking forward to getting to the good stuff, which is, of course, the evidence of the 14 witnesses who follow, and no doubt the hearing from the submitters later in the week. And I don't, Alana and I don't intend to take a lot of time to distract you from that task. But I think it is important to explain for the panel and for the council officers and for other people here what the essentials of Creswell's case are today. Kind of what it boils down to. All that hard work sort of comes into a principal submission, an argument that I'll take the panel through shortly, and some more detailed submissions that largely we'll skip over, but there are some key points that I'd like to emphasise. So there is this document. It's accompanied by some authorities, some of which I might note very quickly in passing, others of which will just be taken as read, but I'll step you through that. So looking at the written document of legal submissions, the panel well understands what the applications are and what they're for, so I won't address those first few paragraphs. So I'll pick up at paragraph 4, please, where I just explain the structure of the submissions that we'll speak to. There's a principal submission, as I say, which I'll pick through quite carefully, because that's the essence of the applicant's case. There are some other sections that we really can pass over quite quickly. That's the background to the applications and the legal framework for the panel's case, for the panel's decision rather, which will be well understood. We will take some time on point D1 there, which is, obviously this is applying the framework, the legal framework to the circumstances of this case. D1 there is highlighting the key, what I see at least, as the key evidentiary issues for the panel to determine in relation to environmental effects. And I'll touch on some issues that I say are not really germane. And then there are some other sections that we'll go through quite quickly about the plans, in respect of which the panel has got some very useful and detailed evidence from no fewer than four planners. So we'll just touch on that briefly. Seems strange to say, but probably don't need to trouble the panel too much about part 2 of the RMA. Nor about sections 105 or 107, but we'll touch on those things as well as conditions, and then we'll wrap up. So beginning with that principal submission at paragraph 5. It's kind of clear, palpable, we're well aware, certainly on Creswell's side, that the panel is considering these applications at a time of heightened awareness and political debate about water bottling, about whether water bottling companies and other commercial users of water should pay royalties for the water they take. There's an ongoing national conversation about Māori rights and interests in water, and the Y2358 Waitangi Tribunal hearing, which also provide a backdrop to this hearing. And of course, we're here in Whakatane, long a centre of debate and leadership regarding Indigenous people's rights in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and indeed around the world. So we feel that, we understand that. A further complexity is that the Regional Council is partway through the process of determining the amount of water that's available to be allocated from catchments around the region, including the Awaiti Canal catchment, from which Creswell seeks a portion of that allocation. And again, the Commissioners, particularly Commissioner Coffin's, well aware of that separate process. Understandably, given that background, many people are keenly interested in these significant issues, which are playing out locally and nationally in different fora. And that interest, I think, is reflected in a number of the submissions that have been made on Creswell's applications. In my submission, though, this case is not about politics or those broader issues. The panel need not, and indeed cannot, take a view, for example, on who owns or who should own water, nor can it take a view on the payment of royalties. And nor, in my submission, does the panel need to second-guess that separate process for determining the allocation. And I accept that will be a difficult exercise of juggling which hat to be worn at which time. But rather, the panel's focus will be on the environmental effects of the project, considered in the context of the relevant planning instruments. And paragraph 10 now. Of those effects in my submission, there's one category that really stands out, and that's what this case is about, and it should be a focus of the panel's consideration in my submission. That's about jobs. the potential for jobs to bring about positive change in communities. The project represents an exciting opportunity to provide a much-needed boost to employment in the local area. There will be no fewer than 50 extra full-time equivalent employees required at the plant. That's a job for everyone in this room, and some. And flow-on effects are likely to create an additional 85 full-time equivalent jobs around the region. And with the potential, if the stars align, of up to 237 FTEs in total attributable to the expanded operation. So these are very, very, very serious numbers. And it's not just the jobs, of course. Those jobs will lead to greater household incomes, associated expenditure, and crucially, improved social and economic well-being across the district, and indeed across the neighbouring Kawerau district and the wider region. And as such, it's unsurprising that any regional economic strategy that one looks at clearly supports the bottling of water as a means to stimulate growth. In terms of the adverse effects, certainly there will be a new large plant building at the site. There will be some disturbance for neighbours associated with construction, and there will be some ongoing effects once the project is operational, including, this may be a focus of the panel, on truck movements to and from the site along an approximately sort of 900 metre stretch, taking in part of Johnson Road and at one end of Hallett Road. Almost all of the expert evidence before the panel, however, concludes that the project's adverse environmental effects, by contrast to its very significant benefits, are small. They have been avoided through design or will be mitigated to appropriate levels. And in particular, just note some of the key points here. The proposed take of water is within the Regional Council's interim allocation for this aquifer. The take is sustainable and it won't compromise the aquifer or affect other takes from it. And nor will the project affect the highly valued Tarawera River. Wastewater discharges from the project will be carefully controlled to minimise effects on the environment and maintain ecological values. The next 2 points go to effects on rural character and amenity. And I say that water bottling at source is an extractive primary production activity with an essentially rural character, particularly when the resource is located in the rural area as it is here. And the project is an appropriate fit with Otakiri, where indeed water bottling plants are already quite common. While people living near the site will experience some effects of the project, the amenity values of the area will be maintained to an appropriate level in line with all the objective standards we can find, frankly, sitting either within the district plan or wider standards such as those applying to altered roads and noise from roads. And neighbours will continue to enjoy their rural lifestyle. This is a fact that's recognised by some of the closest submitters to the site, who will experience change but nonetheless support the project and recognise the positives it will bring to the area. I just note, I'd ask the panel to note their footnote 4. We're in a sort of slightly strange space. I've never encountered this before, where there are a number of submissions on the applications, some of which are by people who would prefer that their identity and their address not be known. Clearly, I know their identity and address, and it's very important that the panel know that too. But the versions of the legal submissions that Alana circulated more widely have that footnote redacted out, and there are 2 others that I'll mention in the document when we get there. At paragraph 13 now, I make the submission. I've kind of been racking my brain as to how this could be criticised, this submission, but I'm going to say it. I think it's difficult to conceive of a rural primary production activity that uses a resource that's renewable, water, a resource that's otherwise flowing to the sea, so efficiently in a way that creates so many jobs while having such a small environmental footprint. Turning to cultural matters, Creswell is very grateful to those who have provided cultural perspectives along the way as part of this journey to inform the project's development. And some of those people and others, other perspectives will be presented directly to the panel by tangata whenua themselves tomorrow, I think. At first glance, the issue of cultural effects appears somewhat complicated. Some submitters, including Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa and Tuwhare Toa Mai Kawerau ki Te Tai, oppose the applications, and others, including Te Tawariki Tuariki and Kokohino Papakainga Land Trust, and Ngāti Rangitihi as well, I should add, support them. At the heart of Māori opposition in my submission is, from what I can read and gather, seems to be frustrations about regulatory and constitutional matters. And I've set those out at paragraph 16, and I'll come back to those later on. Those are matters that, and views that Creswell understands very well and respects, certainly. Creswell acknowledges the mana of Ngāti Awa, of Tuwhare Toa Mai Kawerau ki Te Tai, of Ngāti Rangitihi, of Ngāti Mākino, of Hapu in the area. And certainly Creswell understands why their leadership in the national conversation around Māori rights and interests in water mean that it is complicated, to say the least, to lend support to a project like this one. But the panel's focus must be on the cultural effects of the project. And I say that those effects are distinct from those broader regulatory and constitutional issues. They're effects at a more local level. Discharges to the Hallett Drain, potential disturbance of artefacts during construction, and conditions are proposed that address those effects and in doing so respect and promote kaitiakitanga. Some submitters are concerned about effects on the mauri of the aquifer or metaphysical properties, but the expert evidence at least is clear that the physical properties of the aquifer will be maintained. And in terms of its spiritual or metaphysical properties, which are being obviously considered further in setting an appropriate allocation from the aquifer through the Plan Change 9 process. In terms of those metaphysical properties, the proposed conditions for this project provide a forum in which a framework can be developed to monitor those things. Above all, though, the project has overwhelmingly positive cultural effects in my submission. The project will result, as I say, in this large influx of jobs in a location with a large Māori population and where jobs are scarce. Most of the current employees at the plant are Māori, and this is expected to continue into the future. The panel will have seen evidence from Therese Anders, which highlights examples of jobs at the current plant and the way in which they've enhanced mana and made a real difference in people's lives. Submitters like Kokohino Papakainga Land Trust and indeed Ngāti Rangitihi, as evidenced in their CIA, see the potential for the project to be a catalyst for positive change on a much larger scale than the current sort of 8 or 10 employees at the plant in places like Otakiri, Te Teko, Edgecombe, Kawerau and Whakatane. Stepping back from cultural effects now, more generally, granting consents for the project will strongly promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources in my submission, and they will strongly promote the directions set in the plans by the district and regional councils, and indeed will accord with the Resource Management Act. So that, sir, is the principal case for the applicant, and I'll reverse now, step back through some things, as I say, mostly briefly, but just dwelling on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 very key matters. The background and context of the project, though, is well understood, and I will pass over those paragraphs. Just the key points to pick up on the way. Firstly is that water bottling goes on at this site, as the panel will see when it makes its visit. It's been going on there for almost 25 years, in fact, and there are these 2 other plants, the Orovida and the Antipodes plants, just approximately 2 k's away from the site. The other key point to take from the background, I think, is the size of the current take of water from the aquifer for bottling purposes, and that's 1,200 metres cubed per day. I'm on page 6 now at the top. The nature of the resource consent applications that are sought from the panel are also well understood. Again, there are only a couple of key points to emphasise here on the way through. On the district side, there's this kind of complicated point about section 127, which I'll come back to and I'll explain that, hopefully explain that away. On the regional side, again, I think the key point is just the size of the proposed take of water. So I mentioned before the current take, 1,200 metres cubed per day, maximum. At 27A there I set out the new proposed maximum. So there's an instantaneous rate that's set out there in the footnote 12. A maximum daily rate of 5,000 metres cubed, and a maximum annual amount of 1.1 million metres cubed, which equates to a daily average across the year of 3,000. So going from 1,200 to maximum 3,000 average across the year, or maximum 5,000 on any one day. Moving to consultation and discussions with tangata whenua, with the councils and with the neighbours and stakeholders. Creswell has consulted widely and thus been able to develop a project based on information provided from a broad range of perspectives, in accordance, I think, with standard and indeed best practice for projects like this. There is some dissatisfaction expressed about the consultation that's been undertaken, but if you look at the issues raised by submitters, in my submission, it's actually difficult to pinpoint any that haven't been raised and carefully considered by Creswell and its team of experts. And Mr. Gleisner, in his evidence, and you'll hear from him shortly, describes the approach that the company's tried to take to consultation, and it's been fulsome, open-minded and meaningful. Important changes to the project were made as a result of consultation in the usual way, sort of things being tempered in the fire, both prior to lodgement and since then. And I think it's worth reflecting on those briefly. They're kind of, some of the key ones are highlighted at the top of page 7. At point A there, limiting the hours of access for heavy vehicles to the site, and indeed changing the start time of any movements to 9 a.m. so as to avoid that morning school run. Slowing down the speeds of heavies, query the conditions to apply to that, but there's a commitment by Creswell at least to doing that, slowing them down to what we're told is more or less the optimal speed from a noise perspective of trucks. Limiting other outside activity at the site and external lighting during the nighttime period, and also limiting construction noise on Saturday afternoons to a standard much less than the district plan provides. Internalising the visual effects of the project to the site's been a really important focus as well, and the panel will see the shelter belts when you go out on site. But yeah, that's proposed to be bolstered through additional planting, and there are going to be, I think, 50 or so large additional new trees on the site too. And colours are proposed to, the feedback came back quite strongly. We don't want a big white shed here in this environment, and there are conditions proposed to avoid that. And there are also these upgrades proposed to Johnson Road and the end of Hallett Road, the route taken by traffic to and from the site, and the railway level crossing that's there already, and the intersection with State Highway 34, and installing a new shared pathway for use by pedestrians and cyclists and equestrian people. And there's a bus pull-off area as well for local residents to use. To use, of course, at all times, whether or not there's traffic going to and from the site. Enhancements to respond to cultural perspectives have included proposed conditions to respect and promote kaitiakitanga, which I've referred to already. Other changes include providing generous, I think it's fair to say, stormwater detention measures and reducing the contaminant concentrations in process wastewater discharges. So this engagement, as I say, in the normal way has led to improvements and enhancements, and that's been a very positive thing. And again, on behalf of Creswell, may I express its gratitude to the people who have helped shape the project in that way. The statutory framework I can go through very quickly because the panel, as I say, knows what Section 104 says, that knows, looking at paragraph 35, that it's the effects on the environment as it exists that need to be assessed, which brings me to, which of course includes this existing water bottling plant on the site. And then I get back to this Section 27 point again, just to address that briefly. Section 27 enables a consent holder to apply to change the conditions of an existing resource consent, and Creswell has adopted to take this pathway here. It's applied to the District Council to change the conditions of the land use already held for the site. Ms Nicholas, the Section 42A report author for the District Council, and some submitters have queried the appropriateness of going down that route. And yeah, it's one of the things that sort of leaps out from an application when you read it for the first time. It's quite a noteworthy feature, I think. I say, though, that the issue is moot for a couple of important reasons, important but pretty clear reasons. The first point is not mentioned here, but it's mentioned on a paragraph 25, I think, that I skipped over. The application's been made under 127. It's been accepted by the District Council. It's the power to decide on it's been delegated to the panel. It's there, it's before you, and that's what falls to be determined. That's one point. The second point, which I explain in the paragraphs that follow, is that there's actually no material difference in this case to the panel's exercise of considering this application of 127. It would have been the same if it was an application under section 188. The relevance of 127, though, is of course that it's the effects of the change that are relevant to be considered. And I say that at 37. At 38, here, and this is to explain that point. At 38, I say, the consent, there's an existing consent, but this is not one which is unimplemented, and one needs to kind of imagine what a consent might be like if it were implemented and then try and figure out what the effects of the change on top of that are, and that becomes quite a difficult mental exercise. Here, the consent has been implemented. There's a plant there, you'll see it. It's going to stay, and water bottling's been carried out there for almost 25 years, as I say. And when you've got this, when the consent has been implemented and forms part of the existing environment, the distinction between a 127 and 88 process essentially falls away. Assessing the effects of the change in terms of section 127 is essentially, if not entirely, the same as assessing the project's effects on the environment as it exists in terms of section 104. But some discounts are allowed, bearing in mind what's there already and what's happening there already. That's the key point. I put it there another way in 39, but I think which the panel can read if it needs to. I'll take as read. But over the page, I say that this answers the questions raised by the submitters and by Ms. Nicholas as to whether 127 was the correct route. I should have noted at the start, I'm sorry, says that I'm very happy to be interrupted along the way if there are any questions that arise, or can answer them obviously at the end if that's better, just whatever works for you.
No, we'll just let you go and we'll come in at the end.
Okay, thank you. But the key point is at 41. It would not be right, though, in my submission to consider this an application for a new activity rather than an expansion of an existing activity. That would be an incorrect approach at law. And there is a suggestion that might be an approach that the panel should be taking. Again, there is a water bottling operation currently on site. It's part of the existing environment, and that's a fact. And I say this goes to these issues of these key issues of the project's change or otherwise to the rural character of the area, or whether it's got unacceptable adverse effects on amenity values. And it's unclear whether Ms. Nicholas, although to be fair, I'll explain some parameters around her assessment to be fair to her, but it's unclear whether that approach has been taken correctly in expressing the conclusions that she does on those issues. I'll come back to that. Sections 104B and 108 will be well understood, as are sections 105 and 107. So I'll pass over those if that's okay with the panel, and move to discussing how the legal framework applies to this case, starting with the project's effects on the environment and picking up at paragraph 48. And of course, it's those effects, both positive and adverse, that are central to the panel's consideration under section 104. They're important of themselves, and of course they also go to alignment with the planning instruments and indeed the sustainable management purpose of the RMA, which talks about adverse effects and avoiding, remedying or mitigating them, and indeed to enabling social, cultural and economic well-being. So we go through the effects by category, starting with the benefits. And I make the submission at 51 that there can be a tendency sometimes, I'm sure not here, but there can be a tendency sometimes to gloss over a proposal's benefits and instead kind of hone in on adverse effects. And that's a perfectly natural tendency, and minimising the environmental footprint of any proposal is a very important thing to do. But at the heart of the sustainable management purpose of the Act is enabling. It's enabling people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being. And in this case, it's really important that the positive effects of the project are afforded significant weight in the panel's evaluation. And the evidence before the panel demonstrates that this project presents a golden opportunity for the district and the neighbouring district, as I mentioned, and the wider region. What it does, the project, is it builds on an existing small-scale bottling operation. It uses additional land that currently features a kiwi fruit crop, yes, but a marginal one, as Mr. Gleisner has explained. It co-ops the water that's used for that operation and adds a further sustainable take from a very high quality resource that, as I say, is renewable. It entails a really huge injection of capital into the area, which is the point that shouldn't be missed. And it brings those aspects together to create a large business that needs many people to run it. Not only that, though, it's not just 50 new jobs plus all those flow-on jobs. And this is a really striking thing to me, learning about this case and getting to know the people involved with it, is this fact that the project is to be located in an area where people are crying out for work opportunities. In Kawerau district, the unemployment rate, as at the census before the one just the other week, was 4 times the national rate. Kawerau and Te Teko are among the most deprived places in New Zealand in a socio-economic sense, according to the stats. And it's vital to see those 50 new direct FTEs in that context, or the 126 new FTEs, including those flow-on effects in that context. There will be other benefits of the project too, including improvements to the transport network that will make it safer and simply a better, there'll be just a better quality of infrastructure along that transport corridor and address an environment which is perhaps less than safe right now, but will certainly be exacerbated by the project too. So that's sort of a mixture of mitigation and benefit on that point. Leaving reluctantly the benefits and heading into the adverse effects, they're summarised in the next section of the submission, starting with the effects of the regional activities, followed by the district activities, although there's some overlap, of course, between them. And the categories we talk about are listed there at the top of page 12. I'll start with the regional consents and the effects of the take from the Osakiri aquifer, which I think it's fair to say is the most controversial aspect of this project. I say that because if you read all the submissions, which of course the panel will have done, and those in opposition, they all mention this. They all mention the sustainability of the take. They come at it from different angles perhaps, but this is clearly a concern for submitters, and understandably so. It's this proposal to increase the consented take for bottling purposes to sustain a higher rate of production at the expanded plant. While that point is controversial though, all of the expert technical evidence before the panel is unequivocal. The take is sustainable. It will not result in any material adverse effects on the aquifer, on other bore users, or any surface water bodies, including the Tarawera River. And Mr. Goff is here today and will explain that to you. Those conclusions are based on all the scientific data that's available about the aquifer and its properties, and are based on observed behaviour in the aquifer during testing and predictive effects modelling. I say the evidence is unequivocal on that point. There is some, of course, evidence before the panel suggesting otherwise, including from Mr. Kinau for Tuwharetoa, which we'll get to in due course. But I'm not sure that Mr. Kinau would even say himself, he certainly hasn't qualified himself as an expert, and I don't even think he hasn't attempted to assess the effects of the take, but is instead raising broader issues, which are to be taken into account by the panel. And at 59, Mr. Gleister in his evidence makes the probably obvious point, but it's worth making, that it wouldn't make any business sense for a company to come in and sink this much capital, upwards of $50 million into a plant, only to do a sort of smash and grab operation and take more water than the aquifer could sustain. It doesn't make business sense. It's also obviously contrary to the company's ethos of sustainability that Mr. Gleister explains in his evidence too. The next point at 60 is that, again, reasonably obvious, but the take is within the interim allocation from the catchment provided in proposed Plan Change 9. And that interim allocation is based on an allocable flow of 35% of the annual average recharge amount. Mr. Goff says that that's a conservative basis for the allocation. Indeed, it's conservatism layered upon conservatism, in that the annual average recharge is conservative because it doesn't factor in very considerable groundwater inflows into the catchment on an annual basis. And the 35% allocable flow is a conservative number too, he says. Of course, evidence of that has been heard in that Plan Change 9 process, and as I say, will be swirling around out there. But that's the evidence before this panel from an expert. Mr. Goff's view is that the take will ensure, that the allocation will ensure that the resource is managed sustainably into the future. He also considers, I'm at 61 now, that the proposed take is well within the capacity of the aquifer and catchment and will not adversely affect the long-term sustainability of the groundwater system. And I think the Regional Council's technical experts agree with that. The Plan Change 9 process, which is the forum in which the allocation, an appropriate allocation will be determined, is ongoing, and hearings have taken place, as you know, and a decision is expected perhaps imminently. I don't want to put any pressure on anyone, but is expected at some point in the near future. In the meantime, the rules setting the interim allocation have legal effect, and the panel need not second-guess that allocation in my submission. If the interim allocation for the Awaiti Canal catchment were to change through that process, through the decision, through any appeals to the Environment Court, I think all this panel needs to take away is that there are a number of different mechanisms for the Regional Council to reconfigure things, to look again at the consented takes, the volumes. I've mentioned section 128(1)B there, which is a legal power that all regional councils have under the RMA, and there are other powers too, including through the review conditions that Ms Osmond presents in her evidence. There are other effects, of course. There can be other effects of drawing groundwater like this take, but again, the expert evidence on that is clear, that there won't be any such adverse effects in this case. And I've listed those. I don't think I need to talk you through those in detail, but there won't be effects on other users, other bore users, including, importantly, the Whakatane District Council's take that we're all enjoying today. Won't be any effects in terms of saline intrusion or land subsidence, or on any surface water bodies, including, really importantly, the Tarawera River. Clearly a taonga to the people here, and a treasured possession, and protected with good reason through any number of instruments, including the regional plans, and as a matter that's acknowledged through the statutory acknowledgements of treaty settlements. I've addressed efficiency at paragraph 66, which I'll take as read if that's okay, and then turn to other concerns. So that's the sustainability of the take itself. I think it's worth reflecting on why the proposal, though, is so controversial despite that clear evidence about the health of the aquifer and sustainability of the groundwater resource being not compromised and maintained. Some submitters have expressed concern about the water not being available for other uses, but as the events of the last day or two show, water is abundant in the region, and indeed the catchment isn't fully allocated is another important point to say in response to that. Otherwise, and I've alluded to this already, some of the issues raised by submitters are political in nature. They include objections to the activity of water bottling, or perhaps it's a bottling of beverages generally, and concern that companies, in this case a foreign-owned one, are able to take water for bottling or for other commercial purposes without paying royalties to the government. And Tūwhare Toa Mai Kauro ki te Tai put this quite neatly in their CIA. They say, taking taonga overseas is a national issue. Our resource is being exported for the financial gain of others, and there is no requirement for the resource itself to be paid for. And that's a concern, I think, at the heart of many of these submissions. Those are undoubtedly important things for government and for our wider society to consider. And as I say, it's completely understandable. Speaking for Creswell, it's completely understandable that people wish to share their views about those matters in this forum, but they are not matters that are relevant to this panel's decision. Bottling water is a commonplace and entirely legitimate exercise and enterprise, and it's the effects of a water take on the environment that are relevant to consider, not the end use to which the water is put. I've included in the bundle the Wakatu incorporation case that the panel may be aware of. I don't think I need to take you to it now unless you'd like me to go through it with you, but the short point is the Environment Court there considered an application to take, I think it was 16,000 metres cubed per day from the Motueka aquifer for a community water scheme, where some of the water would be used outside the catchment from which it was drawn. This was a decision of the Environment Court comprised of Principal Judge Newhook. Commissioner Prime was on the panel too, importantly, and as well as Commissioner Manning. And the key passage in that judgment is at 59 to 70, if the panel would like to note that. But the argument, essentially, the appellants...
Carry on. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you. The appellants in that case contended that motion, that activity of taking water away from the catchment and using it outside the catchment had a sort of a blowback effect, as it were, and adversely affected the Māori of the aquifer. I'll come and talk about possible effects of this take on Māori later. That's not the key point here, but the point is that the court was not convinced that the purpose to which that water was put, that end use outside the catchment, was an environmental effect that it needed to give any weight to in its decision. In the absence, of course, if there's a take that affects the physical properties of an aquifer, the end use to which it's put might be additionally egregious, but the court found that wasn't the case there, and in my submission, the same holds here. The water's taken, it's the effects of that are relevant for the panel to consider. It's not really what happens to it next. At 73, foreign ownership is likewise not relevant to the panel's consideration, and nor is the fact that commercial users of water currently do not pay royalties for the water they take. That said, and this is a slightly flippant remark, but it won't be lost on the panel that if a royalty were, if a law dropped in before the panel issues its decision, for example, that requires the company to pay royalties, that would only bolster the benefits of the project. That's a cost. Mr. Gleiss has explained this in his evidence. That's a cost of business that the company would be willing to pay, but it would hope and expect that the proceeds of those royalties would come back to the community, would be used for social and economic advancement in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. So that's royalties. Other concerns about Creswell's proposed take are specific to tangata whenua submitters, some of whom consider that the take would be contrary to Māori ownership of water, as guaranteed by the Crown in Article 2 of Te Tiriti, and asserted, ever since then, frankly, by tangata whenua, including recently in this neck of the woods, in the Matatua Declaration on Water. And the cultural effects assessments provided by Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa describe these as constitutional issues, and I think that's a very apt, a very fitting description. But again, the way in which the law treats ownership of water, no one owns it, everyone owns it. The scheme of the RMA as it relates to allocating water resources and how Māori rights and interests in water should be provided for, those are significant issues for our nation and our region. They're things that the Waitangi Tribunal and the Crown in that context are grappling with. But they're beyond the scope of this panel to change or even to consider. Again, though, Creswell understands and respects that tangata whenua and others see the system as failing them and can see why, in that context, it is vexing for others to gain rights to access water resources. And the key point, though, is Creswell is highly motivated to make this work, is highly motivated to build strong relationships with all those with mana whenua. It deliberately hasn't rolled out an expert to express a view on cultural matters and tell people that their tikanga is wrong, It wants to be respectful, and it wants to build relationships, and it wants to help demonstrate to those people all of the tangata whenua, the cultural and other benefits that the project will bring, while appropriately addressing any adverse effects. And I'll touch on those next. So, cultural effects. And again, Mr. Gleiss's evidence has explained the importance to Creswell of acknowledging mana whenua, being respectful of kaitiakitanga, and building trusting relationships. And making that point again, that this approach grounded in respect for people has meant that Creswell has sought guidance, has let tangata whenua speak for themselves, which of course they're more than capable of doing, and through that has informed itself about cultural values and the potential effects on those values. And understandably, some iwi with whom Creswell has engaged have focused on those broader constitutional issues. As I say, they're big issues and important ones. And that's true, I think, of the submissions from the two iwi authorities that you have. But there is also information before the panel about the cultural effects of the project and how they may be appropriately avoided or mitigated, and I'll turn to those now. But make the initial point at 81 that There's not understood to be anything inherently culturally offensive about taking water for consumption, including from this aquifer, and nor is there a cultural issue per se with extracting, for financial gain, water for bottling. And I think the evidence or CIA provided by Te Runanga expresses that they neither support nor oppose water bottling. And the panel may be aware of plans by Ngāti Awa in this region as well to establish 2 water bottling plants. Nor is it intrinsically objectionable in a cultural sense to extract other resources from the ground for financial benefit. And Tūwharetua themselves, of course, is proudly a supplier of geothermal fluid for industrial use. Rather, the matters of concern to opponents relate to the sustainability of the proposed take, including in respect of Māori, effects of the proposed discharges on Hallett Drain, and the potential for artefacts or other items of cultural value to be uncovered during works. The focus of Ms Simpson's evidence and the cultural effects assessment for Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa, aside from concerns about those constitutional and regulatory matters I've mentioned, is very strongly on ensuring the continued physical health of the Otakiri aquifer, and thereby ensuring that the already strong relationship of Ngāti Awa with that aquifer is preserved and maintained. A perfectly understandable point of view, of course. And other submitters, including Mo Te Aranga, Chair of Ngai Tamawera Hapu, Pauroto Ngaropo from Te Tawera Hapu, and Tūwhakairi O'Brien, expressed concerns of a more metaphysical nature. And they even mentioned the taniwha of the Otakiri aquifer, Te Whakakauariki, Tūpai and Irakewa. There are 2 key points to make about these things. One, as I've mentioned, is that these are matters, either way, physical matters and cultural connections with an aquifer in a physical sense, or metaphysical matters, are all absolutely relevant to that Plan Change 9 process. Those are matters that are no doubt being considered by the Regional Council in setting an appropriate allocation for water takes from that aquifer. And the second point is mentioned there at 84. Either way, in terms of, cultural associations or metaphysical things, Creswell essentially shares the aims of the tangata whenua here, shares the aims of preserving the aquifer's health, and is well and truly open to exploring with tangata whenua ways to give assurance about those matters as the project progresses. And there are proposed conditions that Ms Osmond can talk us through about mana whenua liaison groups, and if that group so chooses, developing a framework for people to monitor adverse effects of the project on the Māori of the aquifer. And in the meantime, without wishing to temper expectations about that process, the courts have been reluctant to conclude that significant adverse spiritual or metaphysical effects arise in the absence of significant adverse physical effects. I'll pass over 86 because I've mentioned that point already. But to reiterate, at 87, the project will have very positive cultural effects through the job opportunities created in an area with a large Māori population and where jobs are at a premium. And the panel will hear more about this tomorrow from Kokohino Papakainga Land Trust, which applauds the sustainability of the project and supports the jobs it will bring. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alana now, who will briefly take you through other categories of effects relevant to the regional matters.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And when you do so, just bear in mind we've read these submissions in full already. So
Thank you.
You don't need to reread every word of every paragraph to us. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin with the effects of construction, earthworks, stormwater and flooding. And I appreciate the panel's point that they have already read these in advance, so I will just be focusing on the key points. So beginning with paragraph 88, as the panel is well aware, some of the other potential effects of the project relate to construction earthworks. And included in this is activities on a hail site, dust and sediment and erosion, the potential effects of flooding, and also effects associated with earthworks near the Tarawera River stop bank. The panel will also be aware that in regard to these potential effects, the expert evidence is basically unanimous that these effects can either be avoided or can be appropriately addressed. So moving to paragraph 90, in terms of the construction earthworks, Conditions proposed include an erosion and sediment control plan in order to minimise sediment migration, and a contaminated soils management plan, given the site's horticultural history. So these management plans have been tightened up recently in response to questions from the panel, and these management plans, along with conditions incorporating standard construction techniques, mean that these effects can be appropriately managed. So not only do Creswell's experts find this, but Ms Nicholas in her 42A report agrees that adverse construction effects will be less than minor, and Ms Cranswick also agrees that they can be avoided or appropriately mitigated. Now, in that regard, I know that there's, as a result of some of the questions from the chair, there remains discussion over the exact nature of some of those conditions, but none of these are significant issues. Moving now to paragraph 92, in terms of the potential for flooding and effects on the stop bank. The design of the stormwater system allows for attenuation of 100% of the runoff from the new elements of the site, up to a 100-year, 72-hour rainfall event, and this includes the potential effects of climate change over the next 100 years. Moving to the stop bank, the evidence demonstrates that the integrity of the stop bank won't be compromised by the works, and the detail of this is in the evidence of Sue Aitken. And I also note that Ms Nicholas does not have any outstanding concerns in this regard either. So moving on to the two types of wastewater discharge that will result from the project, there'll be the sanitary wastewater and process wastewater. So beginning with the sanitary wastewater, if I take the panel now to paragraph 95, both Rob Fullerton and Ms Cranswick agree that effects of the discharge to land with the conditions, with proposed conditions, mean that such effects will be negligible. I note that there's some question of the exact nature of those conditions at this stage. In regards to the water bottling process, there will be two wastewater resulting from two of the processes to do with water bottling. So these are the membrane filtration process and the cleaning process. And it's proposed that these will be discharged to the Hallett drain, which runs adjacent to the site. So as outlined in Rob Fullerton's evidence, sampling of the water quality in Hallett drain has already begun. And while initial results of the water quality in the drain indicate that the quality is low, it's nonetheless important that any adverse effects of discharges are appropriately mitigated in the drain, and that the relevant wording of the planning instruments is taken into account so as to assure that the life supporting capacity of the drain is protected, maintained or safeguarded. And we'll touch on this a bit more in our submissions further on as well. To this end, experts consider that it's important to establish with precision what the current water quality in the drain is as a baseline, and they propose to focus on phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen demand and pH in order to inform trigger values. Now, a condition at paragraph 99 now, a conditions framework has been developed in regard to the discharge. And I note that Ms Cranswick has queried the use of the term adaptive management for this framework. And while we note that this is probably not a classic case of adaptive management where you have an effect of low probability but very high potential impact, there are some useful principles that come out of the idea of adaptive management for dealing with uncertainty. And that's really the intent of setting these appropriate triggers and identifying actions to be carried out by Creswell if the discharge is determined to have adverse effects on the receiving environment. Now, I note that the Regional Council officers have suggested some tweaks to that framework, and there have been some questions from the chair in relation to it. So it's understandable that the panel may have further questions of Mr Fullerton, Mr Miller, Ms Osmond, as well as Ms Cranswick about how it might be developed further. And finally, moving to paragraph 100, in terms of other effects on ecology, Mr Miller has recommended mitigation measures to address some minor adverse effects relating to vegetation clearance and in-stream works. And I'll hand back to Dave.
Thanks, Alana. The district consents will pass through pretty quickly for the first part, and then I'll dwell a bit on rural character and amenity. There are a number of neighbours, of course, who have submitted, a few in support or neutral and others opposed, and we'll hear from them later on in the week. There would obviously be change to the site. There's a large set of works taking place on the site itself, and those effects, there are effects that will be experienced to a greater or lesser extent by the neighbours. The key is that the company is really committed to minimising those and ensuring that people are disrupted as little as possible. And so the company's been guided by experts looking at objective standards and doing objective assessments as to how things can be mitigated in an appropriate manner. And there's an important point at 103 that it's implemented every single one of the recommendations that that large team of experts has made. Talking about construction, and I think good communication really is the key to managing construction effects, and that's proposed through conditions as well as management plan. And I think Ms Nicholas agrees that the construction-related effects will be less than minor, and it's understood acceptable. Call the next category kind of safety and well-being, put them under that umbrella. Talking about changes to the transport corridor. It's not a particularly safe transport environment at present, with potential conflict between trains, cars, pedestrians, horses, cyclists. But those issues would of course be exacerbated by additional heavy vehicles accessing the site. And the short point is that technical solutions have been found and are going to be implemented at Creswell's cost. At 108 now, the district plan also sets limits to control noise to within reasonable limits, and Mr Higley considers those to be pretty conservative, those limits, over and above WHO guidelines. The guidelines that are there to ensure that people's sleep are not disturbed, for example. And he's assessed the noise effects to be well within those conservative district plan controls. And again, just note footnote 79 there, sir, which is another one of these ones that contains information about submitters who would rather remain anonymous. Yep. And Mr Higley's evidence is that the project will have no adverse noise effects at night time. There are other objective standards to apply to road noise, and Mr Higley has explained that effects here will be significantly less than that. And Mr Gleisner again has stressed that that the company is committed to being a good neighbour and to making the transition to the project becoming operational as smooth as possible for neighbours. At 111, I think I need to correct that. So there doesn't appear to be any dispute that the visual effects of the project will be acceptable, and that's not quite right, is it, in light of Ms Nicholas's report. Ms McManaway, Sue McManaway, those here, she provides the only specialist landscape expert evidence on this issue and explains how the existing shelter belts, which I think neighbours are out there sort of trimming probably as we speak in advance of your visit, but most of the vegetation's on our side of the boundary, it's safe to say, and those shelter belts will be retained, of course, and they will be bolstered, and there will be other plantings on the site to ensure that views of the project from beyond will be very limited, actually. Turning to effects on rural character and amenity, and so it's clear that the project will meet all the objective standards, the relevant standards set out and chosen, identified by the District Council deliberately and put in its plan. It won't be particularly visible, and it won't create a nuisance or compromise neighbours' sleep or well-being. There are, of course, questions of whether cumulatively those adverse effects of the project, visual, noise from the plant and trucks, lighting and dust effects, will retain or maintain rural character. I'll come back to those objectives that those words are from, or will have unacceptable effects on amenity values. And that's a key issue. Over the page at 114, I just give a bit of a roadmap to the evidence of the 5 experts for Creswell who talk about effects on rural character. I'll just set out those references for you. That evidence largely speaks for itself. But in essence, those witnesses' views on rural character come down to an evaluation of what the district plan envisages taking place in the rural plains zone. And I'd ask the panel to turn, I won't, this won't take very long, but I would ask the panel to turn quickly to Ms. Nicholas's section 42A report, if that's available to you. It's pages 12 and 13, 13 and 14. Where Ms. Nicholas has set out the relevant objectives from the district plan going to rural character. And the point, my submission on those, as I'll take you through very briefly, is that they focus very strongly on enabling rural production activities. That's not surprising. I mean, you know, rural policies, objectives and policies often do, but sometimes they tend to feature a bit more focus on amenity. These ones, as I say, are very enabling. And they start with strategic objective 4. I mean, Mr. Francis' evidence you will have seen is that probably we should start with strategic objective 3, but we'll come back to that one. Number 4 talks about a strong rural base. The rural character of the district is retained and rural productive capacity is provided for. So there's a bit of rural character there in the objective. But you look at the policies. 1, the zones continue to be utilised for rural production activities. 2, to enable primary productive use in the rural play zone and protect land in that zone from other development that could detract from that primary production focus. 6, to ensure that development does not compromise the efficient operation of rural production activities, etc. Objective Rural 1, again, it's about sustaining the productive potential of rural land and providing for rural production activities. Again, to protect land for primary productive use, it's policy 1. Policy 2, to provide for growth and efficient operation of primary productive use in rural production activities. 3, again, not compromising existing productive use. Objective Rural 2, now character and amenity do come into Objective Rural 2, to maintain and where appropriate enhance rural character. But if you look at the policies, the focus is on visual effects and on boundary setbacks. The policy 1, and policy 3 there. Objective Rural 3, again, it's got an amenity and effects focus. To ensure that development is located and operated to enable people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being, matters that I've touched on that will be promoted by the project, while ensuring that adverse effects, including cumulative adverse effects, are avoided, remedied or mitigated. So provided that mitigation is appropriate, effects are certainly contemplated. And policy 1 puts it this way: to enable rural activities to continue and prosper as part of the rural environment, whilst avoiding significant adverse and or cumulative effects. So significant adverse effects or significant cumulative effects on the surrounding environment. So it's quite a high threshold there, is the key point to make. Let's pick up again in the submissions at 116. The experts for Creswell consider that water bottling activity at the site and those other plants I've mentioned, that those are rural primary production activities with a functional need to locate there. And the plan envisages effects in that zone associated with those activities: noise, odour, landscape changes, other effects, as production takes place and products are taken to market. I've mentioned that there's this new building but design is such that the idea is that visual effects will be largely confined to the site, and there will be a kiwi fruit orchard removed that, as I say, is struggling to be viable. So that's a change from one rural productive activity to another. And there are effects of that change. The main external one involves truck movements. And they will, of course, change the busyness of that stretch of road between the site and State Highway 34. It's actually not a particularly long stretch. It's quite a well-located site to get products to market because it's quite close to, the arterials and the state highway that are built for that purpose. There will be associated effects on neighbours though. And the numbers of trucks will be greater than some other kinds of rural production, more than milk tankers you might see driving around or trucks taking harvests to market, and will be more akin to numbers from other rural extractive industries such as quarrying, mining and forestry. But like those other extractive industries, the issue with water bottling is not that it's not a rural productive activity, The issue is actually that it's so productive. You need, there is, it's just an efficient use of the resource there to create products. And that doesn't alter the rural nature of the activity or mean that the trucks will significantly change the rural character of the rural plains zone, a zoning with rural productive activities and economic growth as its primary purposes, as I've said there, as we've seen from the objectives and policies and as noted in the footnote there at 89.2. Ms Nicholas, to be fair to her, has had what I think is an unenviable task of preparing a report in a reasonably short time frame without the benefit of evidence from Creswell's team of witnesses or support from other specialists. But in my submission, there are a number of key steps in her reasoning that bear further scrutiny by Ms Nicholas herself. Obviously, she'll have an opportunity to update her analysis in light of what she's heard at the hearing and talk to you about that towards the end of the week. But failing that, they'll bear further scrutiny by the panel in my submission. And I will touch on these points because they are important and there's a kind of contrary bit of expert evidence before the panel, so I'm going to focus on those as quickly as I can now. The first point in my submission is a difficult one to understand. It's at 121. And Ms Nicholas seems to have difficulty accepting that the activity of water bottling is primary productive use as it's defined in the plan, or has a functional need to locate in a rural location. And this is it's a fundamental plank, I think, of the reasoning that's put into her report. It underpins the analysis of both the rural character and amenity issues, and indeed the landscape findings that the chair asked a question of Ms Nicholas about from her report. As a result, Ms Nicholas's assessment appears in my submission to be overly influenced by a notion that rural uses equate to agriculture or horticulture. Of course, those things are primary productive uses, and they're in the definition there in the plan. But so is quarrying and mining. And on that point, Ms Nicholas acknowledges that it might be suggested that water bottling could be aligned with mining and quarrying, but in her view, taking water is not reliant on the resource in or under a specific site in the same way as mineral resources are. And with the greatest respect, I can't follow that logic. It's mineral water after all. It's a naturally occurring inorganic compound, just like other mineral resources. And there are already 2 productive bores on the site that access the aquifer beneath. Water bottling clearly needs to locate in this area, noting that the nearest industrial zone is 12 k's away. A related point is that Ms Nicholas underplays on my reading, and to be fair, she may clarify this, but she underplays at best and completely discounts at worst the existence of the 3 water bottling plants in the area. Her report does not acknowledge the existence of the Orovida and Antipodes plants, or note that they're approximately 2 k's from the site. And in tab 3 of the bundle that we've handed up are the consent decisions relating to there's an error here, to the Antipodes plant and the Orovida plant. That should read at 124 there. They accompany the submissions. I feel free, the panel should feel free to read those at their leisure. But the short point is that in granting those consents, the council accepted, or the commissioners deciding those accepted in each case, that the activity was appropriate in a rural location. And at footnote 93, I've noted some of the key reasons given. Again, that footnote 93, that should read Orovida decision rather than Otakiri Springs decision. Apologies for that. Council is satisfied that the activity to bottle mineral water in a rural location satisfies the requirements of a rural industry and is in accordance with the objectives and policies of the transitional plan. It's compatible with the rural area and zoning. It relies upon the location of the existing bore, and so on. In respect of the 3rd plant, I'm back at 125 now. That's the existing plant at the site. There's this 127 point, and I think that, again, that this may have caused some confusion. This point that the query whether it's more appropriate to assess the application is relating to a new activity. And it's not clear to me whether Ms Nicholas has given appropriate weight to the fact that water bottling has taken place on the site for 25 years almost, and that a water bottling plant exists and will be retained. Perhaps I will take you very briefly to the consent decision relating to the site. It's at tab 2. on the third page of that document at 5.2. 5.2a, and again, it's just a matter to be considered. The need for rural location. This is one of the decision criteria to apply in the plan still. Council should be satisfied that the activity is required to be located in a rural zone rather than an industrial zone. In this case, the mineral water source is located on the property. To satisfy export criteria, the water is required to be bottled at the source. This determines the location of the bottling plant. And point B makes a similar point. At 126, Ms Nicholas does accept when considering visual effects that technical limitations on locating this activity are relevant to that assessment. You know, she says as much, and it's that quote there in 126. And I understand that quote to be saying that, suggesting that the panel should first figure out whether the application to take water for bottling can be granted, and if so, then that goes to whether the production needs to take place here, and it goes to the district plan and the effects on rural character and amenity. If I've read that correctly, there are two problems with that statement. The first is that the district plan definition of primary productive use also refers to a functional need for a rural location. So that same logic in assessing visual effects, Ms Nicholas should have flowed through to her assessment of rural character and amenity. And I don't think she's done so. And the second problem is that, again, this suggestion that the panel should first decide whether water bottling can be allowed here, which then flows back to your reasoning as to whether this is appropriate in the rural environment. I mean, that horse is bolted 25 years ago. There's an established water bottling plant there. There are 2 production bores. There's a consent that's current, allowing water to be taken for bottling. We're not starting afresh with these applications. That context is very important. The next point at 128, and Mr Frentz covers this in his evidence, is an omission to discuss strategic objective 3, which promotes economic growth and development by providing for a range of activities in appropriate zones. And I can kind of see why Ms Nicholas has skipped over that, because she doesn't think this is the appropriate zone. I think it is for the reasons that I've given. But if that's right, perhaps that will tip the balance. She expresses her conclusions as being on balance. Maybe that of itself would tip the balance if the panel accepts my submissions that this is definitely an activity tied to its location. But in conclusion, at 1:30 there is an important point too. There's some other information that, to be fair to Ms Nicholas, she may not have had before her when she provided her report. So it's understandable that she hasn't factored them into her analysis. One is this thing about the kiwi fruit orchard and its viability. And the second thing is some points about the scale of the adverse effects, and I'll come back to those. So those are matters to explore. A key issue, effects on rural character for the panel to pick through. Likewise, amenity values is another key issue. And I've set out the legal test there in 132, or the approach that the Environment Court's taken in amenity cases. Of course, and if this would be a good, I'm not sure what time the panel's planning to have a break.
10:30.
What is the time?
You've got 12 minutes.
Thank you. I will make good ground in those 12 minutes available. Thank you. So there are a number of factors that go to amenity, of course, and the residents' subjective views on the pleasantness and the characteristics of the site are, of course, relevant to the panel's decision, and you'll be hearing about those, no doubt, at length tomorrow and the next day. But it's also a matter of looking to what the plan says about amenity values, and it's also a matter of evaluating the objective evidence of experts about whether people's subjective values are reasonably held. And then it's a matter of, again, of coming back to the plan and assessing overall whether those are outcomes that are anticipated under the plan. And again, there's that same expert evidence I talked about before. It's largely self-explanatory, but there are a couple of key points. Now I've just summarised Ms Nicholas's conclusion there at 134, which we need to dwell on. I think that the gist of it is well understood. But my submission at 135 is that underpinning those same conclusions on amenity are the same leaps in reasoning or gaps with respect that I've highlighted in respect of rural character already. So Ms Nicholas does not seem to accept that water bottling is a rural productive activity or tied to this location. And it's not clear whether she's properly acknowledged the existence of the various water bottling plants in the area. And because she doesn't consider this to be akin to quarrying, she hasn't taken any guidance, it seems, from decisions or conditions limiting amenity effects of those types of activities, and I'll touch on a few of those. Nor does she analyse how the existing plant might have influenced, for the past 25 years, people's appreciation of the pleasantness of the area. So a lot of people you'll hear from have come here quite recently to this area and moved next door to a plant, for example. I think it's absolutely relevant to consider the existence of the plant already in considering effects on amenity. And so there's a question as to whether the objectives and policies have been fully or fairly analysed. Another matter the panel may wish to explore is whether the conclusions on amenity are based on an accurate evaluation of the scale of effects. And there are a couple of points about that. Firstly, there's this 184 number to describe the truck movements to and from the site on a daily basis. And, you know, that, to be fair, that's a point that probably could have been made a bit clearer in the expert evidence presented by Creswell, although I think it's reasonably clear. That's a worst case. That's the biggest number. Production's going to fluctuate through the year, and the evidence talks about that. It talks about the winter months, June, July, August. You know, coincidentally, and probably for as a good thing, months where effects of other rural activities might be at a bit of an ebb. And we can see from the applications that the maximum daily take of water sought is 5,000 metres cubed. But actually averaged across a year, the maximum take is some 40% less than that. Now there's no evidence before you that there's any correlation or a direct correlation between the fluctuation in take, fluctuation in production, and the fluctuation in effects in truck movements and things. But logically, you know, taking that 184 maximum point, that will change. That will change from day to day and across the year. And I think Ms. Nicholas, to be fair to her, that's a point, as I say, which could have been made clearer in the evidence of Creswell. Her report presents those numbers as a daily occurrence. Ms. Nicholas also gives considerable weight in her evaluation to submitters' concerns as to effects on their properties and amenity, but she doesn't refer to or appear to have been aware of 2 local resident support for the project. And again, it's that footnote that is redacted in others' views. And to be fair to her, you know, someone would have had to point out the regional council submissions and made her aware of that. Likewise, there's this voluntary reduction of speed to 60 k's an hour, which is not mentioned in Ms. Nicholas's report, and perhaps relevant to factor in as well. Again, Creswell's experts have taken guidance from the plan, the standards there, the objective standards, crafted by the District Council, and looked at other objective standards as well in assessing the effects on amenity. And as I've already said, the project comfortably complies with lighting and noise standards, and external views of the project will be limited. Before the break, I'll just touch quickly on some other examples. Mr. Higley talks about quarrying in his evidence. He's been involved in many of the cases, of course, including some of the quarrying cases. And the cases illustrate that each proposal must be considered on its merits and against the applicable district plan provisions. And there's a great quote, which I needn't read to you, from Commissioner Manning in the Simcox Quarry decision. It's basically, you need to look at each plan and balance enabling productive activities guided by the plan against preserving elements of rural amenity. Again, guided by the plan and what the plan tells you about those things. Over the page, though, in that case, the majority of the court found that the attractiveness and associated amenity values of that valley in question in Marlborough were high. That's a key difference from the present facts here. That was a very picturesque area where there's a lot of wine tourism, very high amenity values, but nonetheless allowed the proposed expansion of a quarry, albeit resulting in a lot fewer movements, about 35 a day, than the numbers that we're asking you to consent here. It's an interesting case. I won't take you to it, but again, another key difference, and it might be, I'd suggest that the panel reflect on this, if you please. The Waido Awatere Resource Management Plan that was relevant in that case, and those objectives and policies as they go to amenity. The amenity values and the preservation of those comes through much more strongly in my submission in that plan than it does in the district plan objectives and policies that I've just taken you through. The discussion in the case is from paragraph 95 onwards. Another example of a quarrying consent, it's a local one for Fulton Hogan's Quarry at Poplar Lane near Te Puke. Allows a maximum of 400 truck movements per day, including 25 at night, by the way, although averaged to four per night over a month. That consent is again in the tab in the materials there. It's at tab 5. I don't need to take you to it, but the relevant conditions are conditions 12, which set that 400 number, and condition 3, which allows those nighttime movements. Again, yeah, amenity values is a key issue, and the panel will no doubt explore it with the relevant witnesses, including, and I will make this last point, including, if necessary, the potential for effects to be further reduced through additional mitigation. I'll make a quick point about property values. Some submitters have raised impacts on property values in their submissions. The panel will probably have come across this before. It's not an effect.
Yep, many times.
Thank you. The rest can be covered quite quickly, sir, but I'm conscious that there's almost break time. I'm probably about another 5 minutes, I think.
Well, you go, you finish, and then we'll have morning tea after that.
Thank you, sir. So those are the effects. The regulations and planning instruments, the panel knows very well the importance of plans these days. I've noted King Salmon and Davidson there. I would love to talk about it at length, but sadly none of the planners have identified any issue that needs us to conduct that sort of analysis. Nothing really there to consider. So this section on the planning framework doesn't seek to repeat all of that voluminous planning evidence that you've got. It's very good evidence, but rather just highlight relevant provisions and criteria relating to 2 key issues and provide a bit of a roadmap again. So there's rural character there. I've taken you through the objectives and policies, and Ms. Nicholas's report also sets out all those assessment criteria relevant to those district effects, which is very useful. Regarding the effects on rural character and amenity, there are assessment criteria in Rule 3.7.28. Ms. McManaway and Mr. Frentz assess those in detail. Discharge to Hallett Drain. There are those key objectives in the Tararua River Catchment Plan, which I know the Chair is very well aware of. There's that sustainable must-tie case, which I hesitate to, which the less said about it, probably the better. But it's in a very different context is the key point. And Judge Smith there made some comments about how that might apply to that situation where there was an existing discharge and the judge expected, I think, a positive move towards reduction in the context of an application to reframe that to discharge in a different way, in a much better way, I should say. It's unclear to me how much use that decision is to this case, where there's no existing discharge, there's no baseline discharge to be improved upon. It's just a new discharge that's been proposed. But nonetheless, the case is pretty clear that this is not a huge effect. And as Alana's explained, the idea is that the life supporting capacity in the drain is going to be maintained or safeguarded in accordance with the relevant words in those objectives. There are other important relevant matters to consider. The Ngāti Rangitihi Iwi Environmental Management Plan, statutory acknowledgements to do with Tarawera River and the economic development strategies and action plans. Again, the project aligns well with those and has no effects on the river. Subject to Part 2 of the RMA, as I said at the start, strangely, I'm not even going to take the panel through. Seems very sad. I'll let that be taken as read. There is a reference there to a case to do with Lake Horowhenua, another area dear to our hearts, to do with the weed harvesting case, which went before the High Court after a decision of Judge Dwyer last year. It's about the treaty, which I'll take as read as well.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that case.
Yes, sections 105 and 107 are, I think, are pretty clear cut. Conditions are proposed. They're comprehensive. In my submission, they're robust, but of course, they can be tweaked and changed and improved. And some very, very helpful questions from the Chair have elicited some further thinking in that direction, and that process, I think, should continue, hopefully in the back rooms through this hearing. And we'll be able to provide witnesses, and we will be able to provide the panel with more information about those things. Term is important. The conditions also provide for annual reviews. So, you know, there's ample opportunity for the councils to revisit things if any unforeseen effects were to arise. And I say that the robustness of those conditions and the frequency of those reviews, the extensive powers of review, and coupled with those 128 powers, if the allocation were to change, they give the panel a whole lot of comfort to grant consent for the term sought by Creswell. And those are 5 years for the earthworks consent and 25 years for the water take and discharges. Although I've noted there that Ms. Osmond might update the panel on some updated thinking about the sanitary wastewater discharge in the term of that. But the take itself of water for bottling, to be absolutely clear, any shorter term than the full term sought would send a bit of a message to the company, I think, and it would have a discouraging effect. And again, you know, it won't be lost on the panel, but just to re-emphasise that there's a lot riding on that. There's a huge investment of capital. There are huge numbers of jobs being made available to local residents. So in conclusion, clearly there are a number of matters for the panel to work through and consider carefully through this hearing process, but I hope to leave you with this idea that it should be apparent that Creswell and its advisors have put in a great deal of effort and will continue to dedicate itself to ensuring that this project is a workable and good one, that adverse effects are minimised, that economic aspirations are realised, that people are listened to and responded to in a respectful way, and that it's a good neighbour that contributes substantial, meaningful, positive change to the district and people's lives. So I thank you, panel, for your time and for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions now or after the break, as I say, and then we'll get into the good stuff of the witnesses. But
All right.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Randall and Ms. Durgan, for that very fulsome summary of the legal submissions.
Yep.
We'll adjourn now for morning tea. We'll come back at 10 minutes to 11. At that stage, we'll pose any questions we have to you, and then we can proceed to hear from the witnesses after that. But just during the morning tea break, can you just, for the two cases that have been tabled, just be prepared to tell us the relevant paragraphs? We'll just write them down on the,
Certainly, sir. Thank you.
the table of contents.
Will do. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we're adjourned now until 10 to 11.